But for now, foreign policy has always been a tricky, storm for many countries, and we'll get into that in a short bit with South Africa's Minister of International Relations that has a very tricky job, most certainly, to, navigate matters of diplomacy, but also, in particular, deal with, very tricky matters of taking a position on very, peculiar matters, and one of which, certainly has seen South Africa modeling itself as a mediator, a peacekeeper to the world. And on the African continent, it sometimes is viewed as, the big brother. According to Pretoria, its diplomacy is centered on Ubuntu, which certainly places cooperation with partners at the thrust of its foreign policy endeavors above that of, all forms of competition. It further notes that its foreign policy outlook is based on commitment to the values and the ideals of Pan-Africanism, and, it is particularly in solidarity with the people of the South. Integration among its southern neighbors is seen as a critical move for South Africa's global economic competitiveness, and a little over a year, Naledi Pandor was appointed to the position of Minister of International Relations and Cooperation. It is there where, she's expected to, it would have been a usual job of directing South Africa's foreign policy, but with COVID-19 and the pandemic, it has certainly changed the way the world operates. Borders were shut, and the matter of the health system certainly has consumed diplomacy. It has also meant that Pretoria had to navigate through virtual diplomacy and to discuss what shapes South Africa's worldview, especially during a time of a pandemic, its foreign policy and direction, as well as, to get an insider's view on how all of this comes together. We are now joined by the International Relations Minister, Naledi Pandor. Minister, a very good morning to you. Assalamu alaikum, and shukran so very much for talking to Radio 786.
Good morning and wa alaikum salam. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Morning to all the listeners of Radio 786.
It's certainly lovely having you. Certainly you can listen to Minister on your radio, or head on off to the Radio 786 Facebook page, where you will also see, as we live stream this morning's discussion, extended discussion with Minister Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister for International Relations. Minister, what has been the environment like, at a time of COVID-19, where ordinarily you would either be traveling and or welcoming counterparts for official visits to South Africa? All of that has largely come to a halt. How would you describe the last 3 to 4 months of, your work and the international arena?
Well, the impact of COVID-19, as you say, has been devastating on international travel. Most countries have in place similar restrictions to the lockdown introduced by South Africa. And because the initial COVID-19 infections in a number of countries were linked to what is called imported infections, international travel was essentially stopped. For South Africa, what happened was that indeed we stopped all commercial flights, but we did have a lot of international travel because South Africans are cosmopolitan. They are very linked into the international world. South Africans work all over the world, and many people who were tourists or traveling, in fact, even pilgrims, were caught unawares by the introduction of the lockdown and found themselves stranded in countries overseas. So part of the work that we've had to do is that obviously we have not traveled since March, but we have had to facilitate repatriations of South Africans from all over the world. And I know which airline flies where. I know how you book charter flights, how you check identity of your citizens and so on, because we've had to be involved in repatriation very, very, very concentrated in a very concentrated. According to the stats that I had last night, we've repatriated 18,000 plus South Africans back home. These are people who were tourists, caught by the lockdown, ran out of money, thrown out of hotels, had to be at the airport sleeping on the floor. Our government had to help to bring them back home. Others were employed, many in Middle Eastern countries, and suddenly businesses are closing down because of the virus and the impact on economies. They've lost jobs, their residence permits are not extended. We have to rescue and bring them back home.
And do you suppose
period.
do you suppose that this has been a difficult way, to navigate through, different embassies and different diplomatic missions, where we've seen countries certainly scramble to get citizens to travel and to repatriate citizens, and sometimes it is really not the best of cooperation that one would get, from some of these countries. So, what are the lessons that you suppose, South Africa in particular has learned in the manner in which repatriation is undertaken, and how, for instance, to deal with some other countries where you may have done business with in the last 3 months?
Well, I must say, Tashriq, that I was very, very impressed with officials in DIRCO, the Department of International Relations. We immediately established a unit whose responsibility was this matter of and evacuation. Remember that COVID-19 has been an unparalleled emergency challenge to governments worldwide. And it crept on us, rather slowly compared to other countries such as China, which had the experience from December last year. We had around 4 months where there was, and then suddenly, middle of March, you began to see infections. And in a very short space of time, the numbers had gone up to about 100, reduce the lockdown. So we had to reorient our thinking. And I think sometimes we did get into some clashes with some of our friends internationally. But in the end, we worked it out. For example, the first repatriation government had to arrange was that of over 200 students and workers who were South African from Wuhan, which had the longest and earliest lockdown by China and most strict lockdown. Our friends in China were not happy that we repatriate our students. But I was getting pressure from parents, from the community, even from my colleagues in government. And the view was our children should come back home because the young people were sending messages back saying that they can't get food easily. It's very difficult to travel. There's huge restrictions. You can't move out of your residence. And they were, feeling depressed, missing home, and so on. So eventually, the Chinese government agreed to allow us on a very strict regime of arrangements, allowed us to come and pick up our young people and our citizens and bring them back home. So you had to, meander this challenge of wanting to respond to your people, but also not wanting to offend the friendly government that you have very good relations with.
Yeah.
With the other countries, it was easier with Europe, for example, because it became a quid pro quo. They had citizens here who were on holiday, and we had citizens in Europe, so we could reciprocate, and therefore arrangements were easier.
Yeah.
Where the challenge came was our regulations that you have to go into quarantine. Some of our international friends were not happy to spend 14 days in a state facility for quarantine. So, we had to have a discussion over several weeks. Eventually, we agreed on self-isolation, but that government would be able to check that there would be certificates that one is tested and negative and so on. So, one has had to work on all these things, which were new arrangements that we had to make. Sailors, for example, in ships that were docking in the Western Cape, they wanted to have change of crew. And you know how many infections were on cruise ships and other vessels. So we were very wary of allowing sailors to disembark, to travel through the Cape, and just even that short distance of getting to the airport. So we had to make secure arrangements for all of that. So we've been tested, but I think we've shown that South Africa is capable.
I've heard some stories of South Africans being repatriated, and upon learning that they needed to go into isolation in South Africa once more, and when things started easing up back from where they came, they then demanded to go back, as if though you were offering a taxi service, Minister. Can you give us a bit more detail about that?
Yes, certainly. One of the things that I had told our officials is that we're not offering a tourist service. We are repatriating persons who say, I am stranded, I have no means of return, I need the help of my government. If someone says that and they're your citizen, in terms of the Vienna Convention, which defines much international law, we had to offer a service of repatriation to them. Some of them then say, I need to go back. We said, no, well, you'll have to make that arrangement yourself. You asked us to help you to come back to South Africa. We informed you we don't do a return service. And so that one we could not do. However, there were South Africans who were in the country prior to lockdown, who normally reside outside South Africa, and who have jobs that they had to return to. With those, we did facilitate their return to the countries that they work in, or their children were left behind there, their families, their spouse, etc. Those we were able to help, but you had to prove you have residence or you have employment, and you're not going to be requesting help again from us.
Yeah. We're talking to South Africa's Minister of International Relations, first spending some time looking at COVID-19 and the work that the department has gotten up to. Minister, what has been in the area of diplomacy beyond just facilitating, travel, as if though you are a glorified traffic officer? What has been, the movements, at least from a political perspective for South Africa? I mean, let's get into one of it, Zimbabwe, for instance. We saw some demonstrations and protest action there, which saw some individuals being arrested. This was tipped by some, especially within the media, to be a crisis in Zimbabwe, to which the government has come out to say absolutely not the case. These guys were protesting during a time that they were not allowed to do so, and that is why they were arrested. South Africa sent an envoy to Zimbabwe to go and assess the situation there. They were unable to meet with all parties, particularly the opposition. This is seen as a snub to the South African envoy, which to a certain degree one can understand. From the Zimbabwean perspective, it may well be viewed that South Africa is interfering. How do you see the current situation in Zimbabwe, and are you contented with the fact that there isn't a crisis as put by the Zimbabwean government?
Well, we all know that Zimbabwe is having serious economic challenges, and that their current situation on South Africa, because many Zimbabweans come to seek a livelihood in South Africa. So we have to work with Zimbabwe in order to address that economic situation and find a way of helping them to reverse the current situation so that the citizens of Zimbabwe can happily return to their country. There's also a political problem. It's undeniable is there, and the people of Zimbabwe have to find a solution to it. We as South Africa are ready to assist. We sent envoys there because there has been huge concern about reports of abuse of human rights, imprisonment of opposition MPs, and many other concerns which have been directed at the presidency and at my department. So we agreed to appoint, the president would appoint 3 envoys, and they would visit Zimbabwe. We'd ask that they meet the government, particularly the president of Zimbabwe, President Mnangagwa, but also meet other stakeholders in the opposition, NGOs, and so on. They unfortunately could not meet but Zimbabwe has indicated readiness to facilitate such a visit, and we are in discussion with the president about the envoys returning to Zimbabwe to have a wider of meetings than they were able to have at this first contact. So we are not distressed by the fact that the full expectation was not met in this first visit. This is something we must continue to work at because, as I say, the situation of Zimbabwe impacts on South Africa. And so South Africa has to continue meeting with, talking to, attempting to help resolve the problems there in order to address, our own situation and focus on the challenges of South Africa. So we will continue to make the efforts.
Well, Minister, it's not uncommon, for a neighboring country, as you put it, that has a vested interest in the affairs of, said countries such as Zimbabwe, to engage and talk to all stakeholders. The reality is that, the country in question may well feel that you are interfering, that perhaps it wasn't the role of the president and Pretoria to be sending envoys. Perhaps if it was a SADC delegation or even an AU delegation, then perhaps it would have gone off a bit better with President Emmerson Mnangagwa. Why do you suppose that it is the role of the South African government as such to intervene and perhaps not a regional approach here as a way to, I guess, mitigate the perspective here that we are parachuting in a few ministers and envoy and talking, for instance, to the opposition? It's no different, for instance, to Nigeria saying it wants to have conversations with the Democratic Alliance if some of their members are being arrested.
Well, if anyone wants to come here and talk to any party, that our constitution and our own laws would allow that. We don't stop people from talking to anyone. We, of course, respect the sovereignty of Zimbabwe. It's very important. But we have to continue to engage. There is a reality, as I say. Go to our border posts and see how many Zimbabweans wish to come into South Africa, and mainly for economic reasons. So it is in South Africa's interest, given our current economic situation, that we do continue to have discussions, keep a very dynamic link with Zimbabwe, assure their government we're not seeking to interfere in their internal matters, but we would like to work with them to find a solution that changes their current context. If they feel we cannot help, we will hear that from them. But my understanding was the discussions were cordial, and indeed that the desire of President Ramaphosa that there be meetings with individuals and organizations other than the government. This was communicated by the envoys.
Minister Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister of International Relations, on the line with us. You can also follow the live stream on the Radio 786 Facebook page. We're going to go to headlines very quickly with Shanaz Gul Hamid. And upon our return, we're going to be looking at the situation out in Mozambique, where to the north of Mozambique, there's been some indications of instability, or at least efforts by certain militant groupings, which have sent a direct threat to Pretoria. This grouping claiming to be somewhat linked to to the ISIS terrorist group. We'll get into that and more in a short bit as we continue our conversation with Minister Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister for International Relations.
Radio 786, news that matters.
The situation remains tense along the N2, where protest action has led to a standstill of traffic. Motorists are being advised to be cautious between Borchards Quarry and the R300. Load shedding commences for a second day at this hour. Eskom says the constrained status of the national grid will see load shedding at level 2 remain in place till 10 o'clock tonight. As South Africans eagerly await an announcement on the easing of COVID-19 related restrictions, the death toll of the virus continues to climb. The State Capture Commission of Inquiry continued to unravel allegations of suspicious corrupt behavior. And the United Arab Emirates' normalization of ties with the Israeli occupation regime has been described as a stab in the back of Palestinians. That's news making headlines on 100.4 FM Radio 786. Stay tuned for the bulletin at 9 a.m.
In our AM 100.4 FM, welcome to this Friday morning. We're talking at the moment to Minister Naledi Pandor. She's South Africa's Minister of International Relations, and we're talking about particularly South Africa's foreign policy at this time. Of course, COVID-19 has been quite a complication for the manner in which states do operate, and a lot of the time of the minister has been spent on, facilitating, certainly from a diplomatic perspective, the repatriation of South Africans and the repatriation of citizens from around the world to their respective countries that were found to be in South Africa. We're also spending some time looking at Zimbabwe, as we did just before the headlines, and of course now getting into the situation also to the north of our border with Mozambique, which certainly has registered some dissent amongst certain militant groupings that is fighting for a degree of autonomy in northern Mozambique, and the country says it is suffering from terror attacks, and upon Pretoria being asked to assist in the fight in northern Mozambique, there's been in official communication and official propaganda sources, for instance, of some of these terrorist groupings saying that if Pretoria were to get involved, then they will certainly be, I guess, reaching out to South Africa or making South Africa certainly within their reach, or and these types of threats that we've seen come from northern Mozambique. Minister, thanks so very much once again for sticking around with us. What do you make of what's happening currently in Mozambique? Are you in any way concerned about this threat that is in fact being made by these terrorist groups?
Yes, we are concerned, obviously, because Mozambique is part of Southern Africa. It's a very close neighbor to South Africa. And if there's instability in Mozambique, I believe as South Africa, we should be concerned. Our Department of Defense and Military Veterans is in close touch with the government of Mozambique. And I'm hopeful that our security services are also in close touch, our intelligence, to ensure that we have our finger on the pulse of the organization and activities of these insurgents that seem to be wreaking havoc in Mozambique. We're particularly concerned about this taking over of a port because, obviously a port is a very important economic infrastructure for any country. And you don't want, an instability that is of a long duration. So I think, in my view, our defense forces and our intelligence services should be working very closely together to ensure that we bring this to an absolute standstill. And I think South Africa has to be serious about this.
And where exactly does South Africa stand on the request to get involved in the situation in Mozambique? Is there an appetite for South Africa to play a strategic, military role of some sort to deal with, as you put it, the insurgency in Mozambique?
Well, I'm sure some of them are listening to us now, so I'm not going to, say we're doing this and that. I'm expressing the view that our governments and the various forces in the security sector are in close touch with each other, and we should give every assistance that we can to ensure that we prevent any activity in South Africa or, in fact, in another country in the region. We should assist Mozambique to stop this incursion.
And this particular port, as you've highlighted, of course, it's strategic in that a lot of trade makes its way through it, and it particularly is it's rich in gas. And so, do you think that certainly at the onset there could be a disruption to economic activity with that port in particular being seized?
Well, we are concerned about the likely impact on the industries in that area. There are a number of South African companies that are invested in that area. And so we do think, it is in the interest of the government of Mozambique to focus particularly on securing what is a very important industrial sector and a natural resource that is going to bring a great deal of benefit and growth opportunities to Zimbabwe. So I think to Mozambique, my apologies. So I believe that we need at the level of SADC, and already the SADC organ on politics and security is looking at this matter. We need to have a dedicated discussion, which I'm sure will occur at the summit next week, when the chair current of the organ will report on what has emerged from deliberations they've been having with Mozambique on this matter.
Minister Naledi Pandor, the Minister for International Relations, speaking to Radio 786 this morning. You can also see the live stream with the Minister on the Radio 786 Facebook page on the WhatsApp line. Reach us there on 0786 10 11 12. Now, Minister, South Africa currently is in the swing of ending its role as part of a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. There are very many vested interests on that council, and the council is having to deal with very tricky matters of Syria and particularly, Libya, which, South Africa too has had as not just as a fraternal partner to Libya through the very many years, but also it is on our continent, and we are equally concerned about Libya in particular. So talk to me about what South Africa's position is, because what we've seen is an absence of the UN and the UN's voice on Libya, but instead you see different proxy countries at the moment using Libya to a certain degree, for supporting different factions. What is South Africa's position on Libya, especially as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council?
Well, the UN has been giving attention to Libya. However, we are concerned that there's been a delay in the appointment of the special envoy of the Secretary General. We have said we'd like that to be an African. And since Ambassador Lamara resigned from the position, no one has been appointed. So we are concerned at that gap and have been articulating this in meetings of the Security Council, the virtual meetings that I've participated in. As the African Union, and particularly the AU chairperson, has continued to have discussions with the different parties in the Libyan conflict, including with countries that are involved as external parties, but very directly involved in the conflict in Libya, that is Turkey, Egypt, and so on. So we do want to see a resolution, but one that is determined by an inclusive process that brings all the Libyan parties together beyond Mr. Shiraz and General Haftar. The various tribal elements, the religious leaders, all need to be brought together in order to agree as to the solution to the impasse, because many lives are being lost, infrastructure is being destroyed, and really at the moment, it would seem that, in 1 week, it is the GNA that appears to have some control, and it is the LNA that has lost ground. The following week, the LNA enjoys supremacy. So it's a very, very unstable situation. President Ramaphosa is in a discussion with President Sassou Nguesso, who's the chair of the AU high-level panel on Libya, that's made up of 5 countries of the African Union. And we are working at this National Reconciliation Forum that had been agreed by the AU. We believe there is potential for us succeeding with this, but we continue to talk to the parties to encourage President Sassou Nguesso to engage both Mr. Shiraz, General Haftar, get them to agree that we draw them together at the AU level. Egypt is supportive of us in the efforts that we're making. We now need to talk to the other external parties and ensure that it's AU, UN, and the various efforts that they've been to seek to address the situation in Libya. There are many, many players. We have, of course, the mission led by the EU, where the arms embargo matter is being monitored. We feel more needs to be done because arms are getting in, and it's really a high proficiency arms. We're very, very worried about that. So we are working at it. It's a situation we must resolve.
But is South Africa at this time, viewing the UN-recognized government of Mr. Shiraz as the appropriate platform of government to sit down with, or is South Africa at the moment, kind of in between the two? We've seen certainly different countries, Egypt, Turkey, taking a position on each side of the different factions, and basically going to war on the ground, on the field. So where do you suppose South Africa finds itself between the two different camps, while also trying to bring those camps through the AU-led process to bring them together? Does South Africa align itself with the UN-recognized government of Libya, or is it that you believe that certainly General Haftar, has a degree of legitimacy that should be considered?
Both parties are challenged by different groupings in Libya. So neither of them enjoys particular prominence. They may be prominent in terms of the public perspective in the media, but there are many groupings. There are many small organized groupings, militia, that are involved in Libya. There are countries that have a huge stake, it would appear, in Libya. President Ramaphosa is talking to all the parties, because you can't speak to one and believe you address it. I mean, you have a legislative assembly. Part of it is attached to one group and another half to the other. So you cannot talk to one party. And what we are engaged in is saying to all of them, we need to bring you into one space, and it is you as the people of Libya, just as we did as South Africans, who will determine the outcome. And this is what the chair of the African Union, our president, is working on. He's talking to all sides. I've been present in those telephone conversations. He's not taking a side. It's not his role to take a side. He has to draw the parties together so that we have an outcome that is in the interest of the Libyan people and their own control of their resources.
Minister Naledi Pandor on the line with us, South Africa's Minister of International Relations. We're looking at South Africa's foreign policy, its positioning, as well as its exercising of that policy, on matters of, the world and worldly affairs. And, so far we've been looking at COVID-19, Zimbabwe, and the situation out in Libya. Minister, in particular, the issue around Syria has, seen South Africa being pressurized. South Africa is being accused of having a misguided policy on Syria itself. And when we talk Syria, we talk about, different actors all together. And South Africa has been almost consistent in highlighting what you call the non-state armed groups that are acting in Syria, that is in effect trying to destabilize the country for a number of years. The situation has somewhat changed in that, the government has been able to, exercise certainly its authority and regain certain, large parts of Syria that has been occupied and taken over by violent militias over the last few years. How do you read the current power play in Syria and that region at the moment? And where does South Africa stand, in this ongoing crisis that you call non-state armed groups?
Well, Tashrika, I need to confess that one of the areas in which we have failed as a department in terms of repatriation is in getting back to South Africa a group of South Africans who are in a refugee camp in Syria, close to the Turkish border. It's very difficult to get into Syria and to get assistance at the official level. So despite very positive responses to my requests for assistance from all sides, we've not yet been able to get those South Africans back home. And they are women and a few children. And we are still working on that. That shows you that there remain very difficult challenges in Syria. And for me, the situation in Syria is an illustration of why we should be very careful about pursuing regime change agendas, where we seek to intervene in sovereign nations and compel them to have a government which we believe is an appropriate government. Regime change has been the reason for the catastrophe that we see in Syria today. The country lies almost entirely destroyed, and the flourishing of terrorist groups, extremist groups, has been permitted by this regime change agenda. So I think there's a lesson to learn from what has occurred there. And what we need to do is really focus on how our friendship with Syria could be put to good effect. We're not overly involved in Syria. I think the African agenda and other areas tend to be far larger areas for us. But I do think, for me, there's been a lesson there about how we should, as South Africa, be wary of ever thinking we are so big that we can compel others to do what we want to do.
Minister Naledi Pandor, South Africa's Minister for International Relations. Do you suppose, Minister, on that score around, regime change that you say certainly has been behind the instability in Syria, that it isn't just purely a regime change on the part of particular militant groupings, for instance, that felt the need to overthrow a government by the barrel of the gun, that there are active partners, countries, for instance, that are supplying of arms and imposing an agenda, for instance, on a country such as Syria. And again, when I spoke about Syria and I highlighted Syria a bit earlier, I think it would be foolish to just talk about Syria as a country. We're looking here at a region, which has always had the fingerprints of certain countries in trying to create instability. So what role do you think, the international community from a country perspective should be taking or considering, at least, when looking at that region and the forces at play there?
You mentioned earlier the Security Council. One of the issues that we have been raising consistently is our belief that there needs to be a very serious look at the concrete reform of the Security Council so that it is enabled to play its full role in ensuring peace and security in the world. At the moment, the Security Council is structured in a manner that is totally undemocratic and unrepresentative of the makeup of the world population and community. So we really think that we should strengthen the ability of the United Nations, and you've seen attempts in the past few years to really delegitimize the United Nations because it could be a force for good. And what those countries that seek to make it less able want to achieve is their dominance as external proxies, causing massive destabilization where they wish to pursue their economic interests. So I really do think we need to do much more about ensuring that we have a multilateral organization that is absolutely capable and equipped to play the role of ensuring peace in the world. One that would be respected, one that is inclusive, one that is empowered and provided with the support and resources to execute a peace and security function.
It is 8 minutes now before 9 o'clock. Radio 786 on 100.4 FM, streaming live on Facebook, the Radio 786 Facebook page, as well as on 100.4 FM with South Africa's Minister of International Relations talking to us, Naledi Pandor, on what shapes South Africa's foreign policy and where South Africa stands in a number of areas that certainly is on the agenda, the global agenda at this time. Overnight, Minister, with at least the last 48 hours, has been certainly quite interesting for Palestine, with South Africa's position, of course, being that it has no diplomatic relations, with the Zionist occupation regime that is Israel. It has, an office there that just facilitates some basic, matters of diplomacy, but no real ties, certainly, that South Africa has with Israel. It comes, at a time when the UAE, for instance, entered into somewhat of a recognition of Israel and the type of dealings that's been going on with the United States, facilitating what they call, the deal of the century, which has largely been delegitimized. I don't quite want to talk about that deal in particular, but where do you suppose South Africa stands on, countries that are being lobbied, both within the African continent as well, to recognize Israel and to recognize it to the point that, there ought to be somewhat of, warm relations with that occupying power that is Israel. What do you make of what has happened in the last 48 hours or so?
Well, one of the things that South Africa and SADC broadly do in the African Union context is to alert countries in Africa that they shouldn't be tempted to forget the plight of the people of Palestine. That just as they supported South Africa in the struggle against apartheid, so must we support the people of Palestine against apartheid Israel. It's a very important point, and we consistently argue this point and assert it in the context of the African Union. Frankly, I am in need of seeing what the content of this agreement between Israel and the UAE is. I am appalled at what I'm hearing in the media, since one would have hoped that what UAE would do, being a very important political and economic player in that region, one would have hoped that it would secure far more concessions and rights for the people of Palestine than addressing the illegally announced annexation. So I'm very, very appalled, and I feel UAE needs to really look at what it has done. I have in the past spoken to colleagues in a number of countries in the Middle East and argued with them that to some degree the cause of the people of Palestine has been forgotten by them, and that they need to more robustly fight for the interests of the people of Palestine, who are their brothers and sisters, and ensure that they enjoy the freedoms and rights that all of us want to enjoy so dearly. Why should they be denied a state? Why should they be denied sovereignty? And why must annexation be the subject of an agreement with the UAE? It should be much more than that. So I'm actually really appalled at what I hear.
Minister Naledi Pandor, the Minister of International Relations, here on Radio 786, 100.4 FM. Minister, as we begin to wrap up, how would you argue, matters of foreign policy and or worldly affairs will look like moving forward in the direction certainly that we've seen? There are extremes on all accounts, be it, military aggression, as you put it, by non-state actors in Syria, and the efforts at the regime change and the volatility that comes with that region. In the African continent, with what's happening in Libya, the continued protection, for instance, and the recognition that South Africa gives to the people of Sahrawi, as you've just highlighted, South Africa firmly in the camp of Palestine, most certainly, that there are certainly different extremes in matters of foreign policy, and COVID-19 has certainly been quite an interesting ride, to the point, for instance, where we're seeing some, countries fighting, for instance, over medicine, treatments for COVID-19, seeking to buy up stock, seeking to, spy, for instance, here and there for medical intelligence purposes, and seeking to come out, I guess, in their own interest. What do you suppose the world will look like post-COVID-19, and particularly in the international arena, which really is your line of work?
Well, I hope that the manner in which the pandemic has drawn the world together will not be lost once we begin to return to a less than normal situation in the future, because we're never going to be the same again. What COVID-19 has done is to expose in a way that we hadn't imagined the inequality that exists in the world. I believe that we have seen, however, levels of collaboration that are very significant, be it in the donation of equipment, support for health systems. We need to ensure that this collaboration continues beyond the instance of the current pandemic, and that we build a form of international collaboration that ensures that never again should any part of the world be left behind when we confront a global emergency of this character. So addressing inequality, poverty, the status of women, is absolutely imperative. And this is what we will argue consistently at the UN and in all international bodies, including our own African Union, because we certainly found there were many countries that were out of step with what needs to be done. We need to strengthen our institutional capacity. We need to improve the economic participation of marginalized groups. Much more should be done on research and innovation on the continent. And we need to build collaboration that allows us to support each other in the most difficult times. So I hope the lessons out of this pandemic will build more positive international relations.
Thank you so very much, Minister. I do appreciate your time here on Radio 786. So we wish you all of the very strength and the best, to continue to play the role that you do in the South African government, as well, of course, as South Africa's, important ambassador, most important ambassador on world affairs, South Africa's Minister of International Relations there, Naledi Pandor. Minister, shukran so very much, and assalamu alaikum.
Afwan, wa alaikum salam, and Juma Mubarak.
Juma Mubarak to you as well. That brings to a close our discussion with Minister Naledi Pandor. She is, again, South Africa's Minister of International Relations, having dealt there with quite a few areas of foreign policy, particularly COVID-19, Mozambique, as well as Syria and the region there as well. Libya in particular came up for discussion, and of course Palestine. South Africa has come out against the position, it appears, taken by the UAE, saying that she is appalled by the decision of the UAE to recognize the occupation state that is Israel. South Africa has also come out to say that it is against regime change, which it believes has characterized the situation in Syria and the Middle East. And as it stands, it believes that this is why it takes a very cautious approach on Libya, and in particular wants to play a very proactive role in bringing the different parties together, stopping short there of coming out in favor of any particular camp, be it the UN recognized government in Libya or that of the General Haftar, which has been a party, a stakeholder on its own, certainly going to war for control inside Libya as well. I know a lot of you have been asking questions about Somaliland. There's been some questions that come in there about Somaliland as well as Morocco and South African ties, and hopefully if we get another opportunity to touch base with the Minister, we will certainly highlight some of those. Thanks so very much, once again, for a very interesting week of radio, and I do appreciate certainly your ears and your efforts for listening to Radio 786 on 100.4 FM. We'll be back certainly on Monday. Until then, have a lovely weekend, and time now for your latest news.